Hi, members of the Vino Veritas Society. I am back in the studio. It's been the first time in several weeks. Unfortunately, today, Dr. Kernwetter is not with me. So just as I came out of dealing with COVID, as he talked about last week during the podcast, he unfortunately came down with it. Now, as he talked about last week, he was vaccinated. He did all those things. Just kind of one of those things that we don't really know what's going on right now. Instead, this week, I asked one of our favorite guardians, Cody Wisniewski, to come join me. And thanks for sitting in with me today.
Of course, Dave. Happy to be here.
Happy Thanksgiving.
You as well.
I can't believe 2021 is almost over.
It's crazy.
We said 2020 was almost over and it didn't get a whole lot better. And then we got into 2021 and we said maybe 2021 will be better. Not a whole lot better. Here's hoping to 2022.
Yeah, only 671 days to flatten the curve. No,
we're somewhere there, if ever.
Yeah,
if ever.
We're back to masks
well,
again.
So why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm Cody Wisniewski. So I am the docent for the Silas Sewell chapter, and in my day job, I am an attorney. So I'm an attorney with Mountain States Legal Foundation. And I am the director of our Center to Keep and Bear Arms. So Mountain States Legal Foundation is a nonprofit legal foundation. We were founded in 1977, and we litigate issues dealing with property rights, right to own, right to use, environmental law on the, fair and safe use side of it. And then we also do gun rights cases, which is what my particular practice falls into.
Kind of applicable considering the trial that ended last week for Kyle Rittenhouse. And
yeah, it's been a very busy month in the business.
I can only imagine. I can only imagine it's going to get more. I mean, we are seeing more and more cases now coming to the forefront, right? Things that probably would have just stayed in a local paper on the local news broadcast. We're starting to see these starting to show up on national radars. We're seeing more people chiming in on Twitter because that's what people do. They chime in on Twitter. It's going to be interesting. I want to talk about that a lot today, and I think everybody will be really lucky to have you here to kind of dig into the legal side and what we really got out of the Kyle Rittenhouse case. I actually saw. We'll get into in a few minutes, but I saw a post you put on Instagram, I think this morning, of just all of the misinformation that was put out there. And then there's this whole question of what are his abilities in terms of the people who defamed him? I mean, there were a lot of people, starting with our current president, who really went out and said some horrible things about him without ever really knowing, just trying to be politically expedient, and it probably is not going to work out in their favor. And I think we'll talk about that too. Yeah. Before we do that, it is Thanksgiving.
Yes, it is.
I think everybody at this point knows we record these a day or two in advance, and I'm hoping we get to release this on Thanksgiving because of illnesses and waiting to see where Tom is at. We are hoping him a speedy recovery.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But we are a day later than we normally do in terms of recording this, so I'm hoping we get this out on Thanksgiving. Any family traditions or favorite foods you like to jump into on Thanksgiving?
See, my family isn't a big tradition family with much, so no family traditions. The girlfriend and I are just going to stay home, do our own thing. I like cooking Thanksgiving dinner.
Okay.
So I have a smoker. I have like a pellet grill.
Nice.
So I like smoking turkey. I like doing all of that.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like we can have created our own little tradition in a sense. So hear me out on this.
Okay.
Because this controversial statement. My favorite Thanksgiving dish is green bean casserole. Now, hold on. I understand that it's universally regarded as the trash dish at Thanksgiving. But you can do green bean casserole on a pellet grill. And so
okay, you got my attention.
Because it's kind of it basically is an oven, but it uses wood smoke. Well, and the cool thing with green bean casserole is because it's like cream of mushroom and milk, it takes on so much flavor. So if you do it in a pellet grill, it tastes fantastic because it soaks up all that smoky flavor. So instead of it just being trash canned Campbell's cream of mushroom soup that nobody wants to eat,
right?
I think Thanksgiving is the only time they ever move any of that product in particular. But yeah, put it on the smoker. It completely changes it. Trust me. Hear me out.
I actually just had this conversation with my mom yesterday.
Yeah.
Because with me being sick the last couple weeks and just everything going on, we decided we're just going to do the three of us, my mom, my stepfather, and I, for dinner. And his favorite thing in the world is green bean casserole.
Yes.
Now, he doesn't do the whole smoker thing. It sits in the oven. It is your very 1950s green bean casserole. It's probably his mom's recipe or his grandmother's recipe that hasn't changed in 75 years.
Does anybody have a recipe, or does everybody just get those like French's onions things that go on top and it's on the back, right?
I mean, that's why you. Although I used to love those French's onion strips. I used to just like put those on everything.
I'm convinced it's one of those dishes. Like you've seen those like joke meals where like in the 50s they were just trying to like come up with meals to like move product and like get rid of government cheese or whatever. I'm convinced green bean casserole was literally somebody sitting there like, we have cream of mushroom soup and we've got canned green beans. Like, how do we sell these?
Well, I have a little smoker box at home that I can put on a grill.
Try it.
I wonder if I can rig my grill and try to
It's fantastic.
up the game a little bit of the green bean casserole.
I will make green bean casserole for you.
I appreciate that. You'll make it for him because I'm telling you, he will eat it every meal.
It's wonderful.
Every day of the year. He loves
It's my
that
favorite
stuff.
leftover, too.
Yeah, so that's fair enough. My Thanksgiving was never actually a huge thing for my family either. We have a lot of traditions, especially around the religious holidays, the Jewish holidays, because those traditions are sort of built in, they're designed in, right? Thanksgiving is one of those things that outside of like turkey and stuffing, maybe cranberry sauce, it's a pretty just standard, okay, people get together, they watch football usually. I don't think I'm watching football this year. I haven't been watching the NFL, which has been a real change for me over the last couple of years. So I'm actually looking forward to the golf. They're doing an exhibition, Bryson DeChambeau and Brooks Koepka, who, for anybody who's a golf watcher,
are they just going to see who can hit a golf ball into the stratosphere?
But they kind of hate each other too. They've never gotten along. It's like the old Phil Mickelson Tiger Woods rivalry that never really existed, but they just played up for the media.
Yeah,
I think Koepka and DeChambeau actually dislike each other. Okay. And they're just going to put them on a course together and mic them up and say, go play. So there could be some entertainment there. It might be the most entertaining golf match we've seen in probably our lifetimes.
Other than like the Barstool golf playouts.
Right.
The Brady. Yeah.
Even those are a little.
Yeah, they're not necessarily competitive, but the commentary's fun.
So on to Rittenhouse, on to.
Yeah, now that I've lost credibility in everybody's eyes.
Yeah. So we'll say you're a good cook or a self-proclaimed good cook who makes great green bean casserole. So there's this whole question over here. But I will push to everybody. You are actually a great lawyer. You are actually a great legal thinker. Anything over there, let's just keep the two things totally separate.
That's for the best.
I think we start with Rittenhouse. Definitely the media, the public, the president, they really just put out all of this information that was just so far from accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's it. What's really interesting about this case is, and something you said in the beginning, is just the prevalence here, like the ability of people to tune in. I would imagine that this was probably the most watched trial in the history of the American judicial system.
You say that, yet nobody seems to know what was talked about.
I know,
so
which
I'm
is shocking.
a little confused about this.
So, I mean, because there are big trials that have happened, right? So you've had OJ, a lot of people tuned in. You had Rodney King, a lot of people tuned in. John Benet Ramsey. Like there are cases that people really tuned into and paid attention to. But just with modern technology, people were able just to open up YouTube and watch snippets of the trial. The problem is it's long. People have jobs or have other things that they want to do, right?
We hope.
Some people have jobs. Some people are otherwise preoccupied during the day. So I doubt that many people watched the full trial, but is certainly one of, if not the most watched trial. And I think it's exposed a lot of things. I do think a lot of people recognized some of the media narratives coming out. And I don't think that it was people just on the more like conservative libertarian side. I think more progressives recognize that too. You saw a lot of people on Twitter react of saying, wait a minute, Kyle Rittenhouse killed white people? Right? Like that was a shocking revelation to the social media world. And so it's clear that the narratives that were being put out pre-trial just did not in any way align with the actual facts of the situation.
Right. So this was a comment of the judge. Was it Schroeder? Schroeder. Judge Schroeder at the end of the trial made a comment to, I don't know if it was the media or where the comment came out, but he came out and said, I don't know that I want cameras in the courtroom in the future. And it's a really interesting juxtaposition because you've got one side of me sitting here thinking, well, yeah, because there were clearly people who were seeing things happening in the trial and using that to try to influence the trial, right? You had the MSNBC, supposedly, what was he? He was a contract investigator or photographer that was following the tour bus or the juror bus and doing all that. But then you had threats against the judge and you had threats against all these other people in the courtroom. And for all those reasons, you think, yeah, maybe trials shouldn't be televised. At the same time, imagine what would have happened if it wasn't televised and then we were relying on, or the majority of the country was relying on CNN and MSNBC to tell them what was happening. Then there would be this huge separation because then there's no video that says, look, everything you know about Kyle Rittenhouse is wrong.
Yeah.
That would have been their line is he killed black people. He went looking to kill people. He was there. He was trying to execute vigilante justice. It wasn't really the case.
No, not at all.
And if the cameras weren't there, nobody would have seen that.
Exactly.
And can we really rely on a media that doesn't show actual video of this?
No. And so that's the big problem, right? Is corporate media is running on its own intentions at this point, right? They're not reporting the news anymore. They are ideological organizations that are, conveying a pre-structured message. I'm a big fan of cameras in the courtroom.
Okay.
And it's because it gives people access to what the real justice system looks like.
You mean Law and Order isn't real?
Shocking, I know. Suits is not quite accurate. I think they did a really good job with how they handled kind of sequestering the jurors, right? And so you never saw them on camera. And so it was just the court staff, it was just the attorneys and people in the audience. I think that's really important. Will media try and use that against people? Yes, sure. Like they'll pull snippets. There will be, threats towards the judges. That's part of being in this role of being a kind of a public figure in a sense, right? Judges are public figures. We trust them to uphold and enforce the law. And so that's kind of just part of it. I mean, nobody should be threatened, but you know what I mean.
Sure.
But having that level of access to the justice system is hugely important for the American people because most people don't understand what a courtroom is like, what it's like being in front of a judge, what it's like trying to make your case to a jury. And I think what this case exposed more than anything when people are going to be looking back is how bad prosecution is, right? And so we saw what it looks like when prosecutors try cases in front of juries. And so this is a big problem, right? We have this problem where prosecutors are incentivized to plea out cases. They want to get a win on the books. And basically, a plea deal is, for those that aren't familiar, let's say you're charged with 5 things, ranging from like a misdemeanor to a felony that's going to put you in prison for life. So a prosecutor will go to you and say, Dave, look, we got a pretty good case here. You're going to go to jail. You're going to jail. I might not be able to get you on life, but I probably can get you on life.
Right.
Or, I'll tell you what, why don't you plea out 5 years is the maximum sentence for this, minor charge. We'll let you, we'll recommend to the judge because you're great and you're agreeing with us. We'll recommend to the judge that you only serve 2. You do 2 years of probation. You're free and clear. You don't have to go on trial. Your name doesn't get harmed in that way. And we solve this the easy way.
Right.
I mean, that's a nice situation. There are many like prosecutorial misconduct cases where prosecutors hold family members over people, kind of threaten them in other ways. And so people take the deal. People are afraid. If you have a public defender, if you can't afford an attorney, public defenders have the heaviest caseload of anybody. And so they're looking at their attorney and their attorney's going, look, yeah, we could take this to trial, but it might be a year and a half, 6 months, 8 months, who knows, before we get to trial. And then we're going to have to try and make the best case. So there's all these incentives to avoid jury trials. But jury trials are really important. I mean, we have it in the Bill of Rights because it's that evaluation of the peers. And so I think a lot of people saw what it looks like when prosecutors try cases that they probably don't, they probably knew they didn't have the facts necessary to prove up all of the charges. I think they thought that they could probably, it's kind of a revelation halfway through the trial that they thought they might be able to get Kyle on provocation, which we can talk about. But I think they pretty well knew that they didn't have a very strong case, but they just had to try it for political media purposes. Its own problem.
And that's also what a lot of prosecutors do is they will go after as many charges as they possibly can.
Yeah.
Assuming a chunk of those are going to get thrown out. You talk about jury trials, though, and this is something I think Tom and I have even talked about on podcasts in the past. I've sat back quite a few times, and I hope I never end up in front of a jury. I hope I never do anything that gets me there. So far in life, I've made it without ending up in court for anything more than a traffic issue.
Demand a jury trial.
So you say demand a jury trial. And part of me, I've been really torn about this for a long time because our education system, which we've talked about ad nauseum, and the media and the way things are portrayed in the media, it's very rare, especially in a big trial, that people know nothing about the case going into it. And if I'm sitting there and I'm Kyle Rittenhouse, I'm thinking, can I get an impartial jury who's actually going to sit and hear the realities of the case, or are they going to be already having their own preconceived notions going in, whereas a judge is supposed to? And we know how judges have been, and we know there's a lot of issues with judges as well, but at least a judge you'd hope is more familiar with the law. And in this case, I think we saw he was, right? We saw a judge in this case who said, this is the law and you're going to stick to it. And when the prosecution went down the road of well, why haven't you talked about the trial in the last 2 years? He was going against 200 years of case law. There's this whole sort of question here of he took a risk by taking a jury trial. In this situation, knowing Judge Schroeder and his attorneys clearly did, his second set of attorneys. First set of attorneys, why he would go with Linwood in the first place, other than probably Mike Lindell was paying for it.
Yeah.
Whole lot of questions there for me.
Yeah. A lot of interesting things there.
So I guess the big question for me is was he right to go? I mean, obviously the hindsight, right? It worked.
Yeah.
But if you were his attorney, would you have said jury trial is the way to go here?
Absolutely.
Why?
So here's the difference. Nobody's impartial, right? There's no person that doesn't walk in there with some level of, pull from multiculturalism, inherent biases.
Right.
But that's a real thing, right? There are people in life that are super familiar with the AR platform that Kyle had and know that it's just a, semi-automatic rifle. It's nothing special.
Yep.
There are other people that are going to see that and think, oh, that's a weapon of war, right? Mm-hmm. So you're going to get all these different perspectives. Here's the difference. With a judge, you have one. You get one perspective. And yes, they're impartial, but just about every public interest attorney in this country can tell you that when they bring a case, they can tell whether or not they're going to win or lose at the district court as soon as their judge is assigned. Because judges have long-standing philosophies. You can read their opinions in the past. You know how judges think.
Sure.
It's all public record, so you can figure that out. Well, with the judge, you get no balance there. You just get the judge, their perspective, and their view. With a jury, you at least get people balancing each other, right? And so you get 12 people that all have to interact with one another. They are going to have to talk about those things. They're going to sit in the deliberation room and they're going to chat about it. You also have the opportunity to make your case to a person, a human being that lives in the world, is from your community, understands your local information, right? And so one of the big things that came out, and the huge talking point was Kyle Rittenhouse crossed state lines.
Right.
Well, Kyle Rittenhouse drove 20 minutes.
Yeah.
It's literally would be like driving from here to Boulder.
Yeah.
Right? If there just happened to be a state line in between. Well, this perspective of Kyle Rittenhouse crossed state lines, everywhere else was this huge, obviously he had the intent to do something bad. Well, those jurors are from that community. They know where those cities are. They know what 20 minutes away looks like. They know that people commute there. So you get those kind of hyper-local perspectives, which is really important. You get that balancing between different individuals. Plus, a judge makes decisions every day. They're kind of desensitized to the outcome of their opinions because, they're firing off opinions every week, every day, denying motions, denying prisoner relief. Like, you can become, I would imagine, I'm not a judge, but you can kind of become desensitized to that sort of what the actual effect of your decision is a little bit. Jurors, no. I mean, those are real people that have to go and live with what they did.
Yeah.
And our system is biased towards defendants. And so those jurors have to go home and if they convict, they have to go, I was positive because they just sent a man to prison or to death row or the life imprisonment or 30 years, whatever it is, right? They have to live with that. And that level also introduces some care, some level of it's a buffer in a sense where it's more likely that they're going to need that extra piece to convict because they're human beings.
I get that. I guess the other piece of it for me, and like I said, this has been something I've kind of personally thought about. Again, hopefully never have to actually face this question. But I guess the other part of it for me is he was a district court judge, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, like a state court.
So he's elected. Am I correct?
I don't know. That's interesting. I don't know what the state policy is on judges. Every state varies.
Right. So that would be the other question, right? Is
he an elected?
Does he make if you are in front of a judge that is elected, or is even appointed by somebody, right? Your decisions become politicized. Your decisions are in this realm of either one. Look, if let's say he's appointed by the governor or appointed by a mayor, if he's not elected, this is a high enough profile case that somebody on the left could easily run for office next time saying, I'm running on the sole platform of getting Judge Schroeder off the bench.
Oh, yeah.
And there will be thousands of people in Kenosha who will probably vote for that person if they have that ability.
Yeah, there's also, I mean, a lot of states have recalls for judges. Judges go up for confirmation. So in Colorado, judges go up for confirmation every so many years.
Yeah, I don't know.
Look, judges are probably the least political, but they're political. You can't get onto the bench without having some level of politics.
Sure.
Whether it's an election, an appointment, it doesn't matter. You have to have some network and involvement. And so that is a big factor in that. And I'm sure, if they have recall abilities, there'll probably be a big effort to recall him. If it's an election, I'm sure that there will be some tough competition. I would imagine it's a recall, which is the most common. And so I'm sure there'll be a recall effort or a non-confirmation effort.
Right. One of the things you talked about was the claim, the belief, the media message that went out there that said, Kyle Rittenhouse crossed state lines looking for trouble. Several prominent blue check marks on Twitter have actually gone out and said he was a vigilante. He was there trying to be Batman. Right?
Yeah.
To me, that's problematic. And I go all the way back to our founding, to the revolution. When we had the revolution, this wasn't like a standing army that we said, hey, we've got an army here in the colonies and we're going to go fight the British. No, it was a bunch of individuals who said the government is not doing its job. It's not protecting us. It's taking advantage of us. It's hurting us. And we're going to go do something about it. I would almost make the argument, and there have been a lot of people who have some agreed, some disagreed, and I made the argument. I'm not sure where I stand on it fully, but made the argument that Kyle and his two friends that we learned about during the trial were more of a militia than vigilante. It's a big question about what is a militia, and I think we never really got a true definition out of the Constitutional Convention or anything since of what actually constitutes a militia and who gets to define what that is.
Yeah, so let's talk self-defense. So there is the Militia Act of 1792, which defines out kind of the requirements of militias and a little bit of those definitions, what you're talking about, what they mean. And essentially it's comprised of, if I remember the age range, I think it's 17 to 40 males, obviously with the, biases of the time, it's 17 to 40 males and these property owning kind of classes. They had to own, so you were legally required to own certain weapons and certain armaments. Some of the more wealthy would be placed as like cavalrymen and they were required to own. the things necessary for horses as well. And so the militia was kind of this unorganized militia, right? It's this sense of like these individuals in a community that have the ability to respond with force if necessary. And so I think you could kind of talk about that idea. I actually think that there's a clear analog potentially for Kyle. I mean, one, just self-defense, right? It's this clear kind of straightforward. But if you want to go back to kind of founding era, right, there's this idea of the posse comitatus, right? And so this is a theory that kind of dates back to the Shire Reeve, the sheriff,
Okay.
Which is our true oldest elected law enforcement office. There is nothing better than a constitutional sheriff. If you're going to give government the power to use force, you better be giving it to a constitutional sheriff. That is the best form of law enforcement. The Shire Reeve and sheriffs in early American history, and actually often today by statute, had the ability to call on the public for help in enforcing law and in defending themselves. And you saw something like that in Kenosha. You saw, the state government pulling back and the city saying, don't, we're not going to do anything. Let them do what they're going to do. We're not going to get involved. And there were statements by law enforcement saying, look, people, you're going to need to go out and defend yourselves. You're going to need to go defend your own property. Mm-hmm. And that was something that people in the media caught on to. And they're like, well, law enforcement sent these vigilantes out, not even realizing that this is one of the most grounded powers of law enforcement,
right,
is the ability to call forth the public for help. And so it really is kind of this blend, in a sense, between the militia, which is tended to be more of a military function, and the posse comitatus, which was more of a law enforcement function. And so I do think that there is an analog between those two. And I think you could kind of point to that and start looking at this foundational power of, not only people's right to defend themselves and their ability to defend themselves, but also the kind of ability of some state actor to, call forth that, because the militia had to be called forth as well.
Well, that's sort of the big question here, and it's interesting. I guess we talked about, I think it was a case study 3 months ago about standing armies.
Yeah,
and we talked about in that case study this idea of there is no constitutional basis for a standing army, or there wasn't initially. And, and you can make a valid argument for a standing army to a certain extent today. And well, you're giving me that look, so I'll explain where I'm going with that.
It's a skeptical Cody
look. And that's fair because it is a big question. And
I'm sitting in Tom's chair. Yeah, I have to embody the constitutionalist.
That is fair. So I'm going to try to make a constitutional argument to the constitutional attorney.
Okay.
The Constitution does provide for a standing Navy.
Correct.
The justification for a standing Navy is there are things like ships and other things that exist within the Navy that you can't just whip up on a 2-week notice and say, hey, we've got to go fight a war on the ocean and we need to do this, right?
Yeah.
And so you have that purpose. And I think that sets a precedent within the Constitution of if you can do that. I think they're within all of the divisions now of the military, all of the branches of the military, you could justify to a certain point that standing army, that standing Air Force, that's for those things, for the things that require specialized training that is always ongoing, that is always being updated, understanding how to use, technology isn't the type of thing that you can just sit somebody down at some of these, you think about some of these computers and drones and everything that our military uses today. You can't just sit some random member of a local militia down and say, okay, you're going to go operate this drone that can drop a 2,000-pound bomb on some country, right? You want those people. So that's my line, right? Yeah. As long as it's something that needs specialized training, ongoing training, and certain equipment that can't be whipped up in a matter of time, that to me falls under the constitutional argument for the standing Navy. Is that fair? I mean, you can push back.
No, I'm actually agree with you. Yeah, I think you're right. I think we might have talked about this a little bit before. So yeah, I think under the standing Navy, exactly what you said, right? Ships can't be built in a day. And so they understood that naval power was important, and so they decided to grant that power to Congress to, authorize, oversee kind of the standing Navy or the creation of the Navy. And so today, I mean, I don't know what the modern jets that we use. I haven't like paid attention to like fighter jets since I was like 15 and wanted to be like a fighter pilot.
Right.
But like the F-18, right? The F-18 is the modern equivalent of a warship in 1789.
Right.
And so I think that's true, right? The people that manned the, ship in 1789 are the same as the pilot that flies the F-18 today. So I think that is true. Obviously, that should be a lot more limited.
Without a doubt.
Yeah, than what it is. I think it's interesting. So the reason why we have a standing army, too, is because we picked a fight with British North America in the War of 1812, summarily got our asses kicked.
We're good.
Okay.
We're good. It's behind a paywall. Sorry for anybody who got offended.
Summarily got our butts kicked. They burned the White House down. And then they went back and were like, hey, if we're going to be picking fights with people, we need a standing army, which is the totally wrong way to think about this, right? Of we were the aggressor, depending on who you talk to, potentially is this manifest destiny idea of taking over the entire continent rather than just going from sea to sea. We were the aggressor, we lost, and our response was like, well, now we obviously need a military. It's like, well, maybe we shouldn't have picked a fight with British North America. Like, maybe that was the right role. But,
right.
But yeah, I think that you can have a standing navy that is comprised of aircraft carriers, battleships, those sorts of things, maybe tanks. There are some things that you could probably analogize back to the founding.
And I think that's where you get to, right, is things like tank warfare, which has become, since World War I, really, had become a major part of military engagements. I think that's probably significantly on the decline now. I don't think battles in the future are going to have a lot of ground forces.
I disagree.
Really?
Yeah, I think that's going to be a big thing.
Tell me.
Well, so I think that you're going to see, a lot of the powers that are having conflict right now, right, are not the world superpowers. It's not the guys that have drones and have nuclear capabilities, right? So most of those conflicts are between less developed nations. So you're still seeing ground forces. You're seeing old tanks and old armored vehicles. I also would not be shocked if it comes to like some sort of war between superpowers. If we get into World War III, let's say, there's going to be a lot of aerial work. There's going to be but there's going to be standard land warfare in places like dealing with land in Africa and things like that. You are going to see standard land warfare because you need to control borders. People need to control populaces. You need to get the people on your side. And so a lot of those things, you have to have that ground presence.
Interesting.
You can't just have a video game war. There's no victory in a video game war. There's no victory without that level.
It's a big statement.
Well,
but you're right.
And so I think that's key. But the important thing here, too, is remember, so while the Constitution gave the authority for a standing navy, the Constitution also authorized Congress to hire privateers, right? And so a privateer is essentially just like a legalized pirate. They got to use their people that owned ships, had crews, had cannons, could be authorized by the government to go and enforce law or protect interests on behalf of, the crown was the big one, or the U.S. government at this time. And so what that speculates is that there are private people that also have the power, a level of power that they can aid in warfighting and in battle. Right. And so it's that kind of power dynamic. It was much more level in 1789, and now it's, completely skewed. And part of that, too, was, well, look, we might have a standing navy, but then we have the ability to call up the militia. And we have the ability to call up people to fight in, defense of our nation. And that has kind of been lost in this kind of modern world.
But I think there's a separation, and this goes back to the Rittenhouse case,
we're fairly far flung at this point now.
I know, but I'm going to do my best to bring it back here because I think you just did it.
Oh, you're welcome.
Naturally. The reality is, whether you call it a posse, whether you call it a militia, whatever it is, we did have this foundational idea that this is about we the people. This is not, we're not here to answer to the government. We're not here to be called upon by the government when they think that we're needed. It's we're in charge. And if the government needs assistance in a battle that it's engaging in, War of 1812, let's say, it can call on us, and it's our decision, right? They can't force somebody. I mean, they can, but they're not supposed to be able to force somebody to say, okay, you're in the militia, and this is the battle we're going to face. So you got to show up, and you got to be here. If we the people say this isn't a just war, I'm not going to go fight in this war. There should be no constitutional bearing, or there should be no constitutional justification by the government to say, yep. I don't care if you think this is a just war or not, you're going to go fight in it. And it's a really kind of touchy subject. But at the other end of the spectrum is, if the government is trying to engage in things or it's not fulfilling its proper role, we the people are still in charge.
Yeah.
And if you have an organized militia or if you have an organized posse, that organized group has a right to self-defense, to defend its property, defend its privately owned personal property. And what we had in Wisconsin was a government unwilling to do that.
Yeah, and I mean, our system is based around individual sovereignty, right? We don't have a sovereign sitting in a chair in D.C.
We kind of do
now. We're not supposed to. So our system is based on individual sovereignty, right? We've given government certain power, and we've retained a significant number of our rights.
Right.
That power that we gave is the power to infringe on portions of our rights, but it's limited. And so, the taxing power, whether you like it or not, government has the power to tax.
State government originally had the power to tax.
Federal government has tax and spend power.
It got it later.
No, they got income tax power later.
Okay,
they had
right.
tax power.
They
in
had
the
tax.
Constitution.
You're right.
But a tax is an infringement on your individual rights. But we've given that up, or people gave that up on our behalf, and there's implied. Well, that's a far field. But it's not just unorganized militia or a posse comitatus that has the ability to, stand up and defend. You do. I do. Everybody listening does. You have the right to self-defense. So with the Center to Keep and Bear Arms, right, what our focus is fighting for the natural right of self-defense from both man and tyranny. And that is the basis of the right, right? It's not hunting. It's not sporting purposes. The importance, why it was elevated the way it was focusing on that element of self-defense, which includes defending me, defending your community, defending your country, and whether that's from enemies, foreign and domestic, right? So people have that right. You have the right to defend yourself and to defend your property. And that's been lost. And I think what we're seeing now is, so you kind of saw this narrative in the trial, right, of what Kyle killed people, or, they used the word murder. Murder is a legal term meaning an unjustified killing or an illegal killing. So, that was the first step. Kyle's a murderer is the line.
Right.
And then they went through all of these different narratives of, he definitely killed them and he wasn't justified. And then, he definitely didn't do it in self-defense. Well, it was definitely provoked. And so you saw the line kind of trend. What I think is interesting is after the trial, what you saw after the decision, you saw people saying there were headlines of what Kyle did was self-defense and, was legally self-defense. And that's what's wrong.
Right.
Is that our justice system is wrong because you can't defend yourself. And only now are we really looking at this. And it's scary to me that there are people out there that are saying, even the prosecution and closing arguments, he should have just gotten to a good old-fashioned fist fight. Like, in what world, when somebody is attacking you, threatening your life, are you required to drop to their level of defensive ability? I mean, a lot of people, so there is this question of, level of force, but if somebody is threatening you with grievous bodily injury is a legal term, or serious bodily injury, or your life, you get to defend your life. That's a basic tenet. Right? I mean, that is foundational. And this isn't just Kyle, at a BLM protest armed. This is so what a lot of people weren't paying attention to is while the Rittenhouse trial was going on, there was another trial going on. So the Arbery trial, which deals with individuals, this question of self-defense, which is way more muddled, right? Because those individuals were following Arbery as he was leaving a construction project. Like he had walked through there, and they claimed that they were trying to protect their community, and he was killed. But he was jogging through the community, is what people said. So that one's more muddled. There's another trial that went on, and so this was Andrew Coffey.
Right.
So Andrew Coffey was sleeping in his home with his girlfriend when a loud bang goes off. He wakes up and he sees a rifle pointed in his window. And so what do you do? I mean, you have a gun on the bedside table. What do you do?
You grab your gun.
You don't stop and start asking questions. There is a loud bang and somebody's pointing a weapon at you. He grabbed his gun, he fired, and there was a lot of individuals out there. In the crossfire, his girlfriend was killed, and he killed 3 law enforcement officers. SWAT. It was a SWAT no-knock raid. They had a warrant. I don't remember what the basis of the warrant was, but it was a no-knock in the middle of the night. And he went on trial for the, potential murder of 3 law enforcement officers. They were also trying to hold him liable for the killing of his girlfriend, even though his girlfriend was killed by the SWAT guys. Mm-hmm. And he was found not guilty of killing law enforcement officers because he was justified and a reasonable person in defending his life. And so this isn't Kyle is this kid at a riot or at a protest, and the system is okay with him. Mm-hmm. No, our system is okay, and our system authorizes people to protect their lives. I mean, that's fundamental.
Right. The interesting thing with the Coffey case, and I think this just goes back to our loss in this country of an understanding of the self-evident truths, the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness.
Yeah.
People are now getting themselves far too often into situations, and there are other people out there who have just said, you don't have a right to life, right? I mean, there are plenty of people out there right now saying, Kyle Rittenhouse doesn't have a right to live anymore.
Yeah.
I don't care what the judge and the jury said. Kyle Rittenhouse doesn't have a right to life anymore. And when you start to say that you don't have this foundational right to life, and we've abandoned as a society this basic idea that you don't have a right to go kill anybody, Coffey didn't know that was a cop.
No.
And that was what caused this whole problem. He didn't sit there and say, oh, great, I get a chance to kill a cop. And nobody's sitting here saying that Coffey was an angel and that
he's still going to jail.
Right.
He had a felony charge prior, and so he's a felon in possession of a firearm, which carries a federal penitentiary sentence of up to 30 years.
Which I think there's a similar situation that's going to come out of the Rittenhouse trial, right?
No. Possession of a rifle by a 17-year-old?
No, I'm talking about the guy he shot in the arm.
Oh,
and I'm
Gage.
not remembering. Is it Gage?
Yeah,
Grosskreutz. I've been getting some of the
Twitter updates.
The other guys mixed up, the names mixed up of who's who, and I never want to use one of their names who was maybe Kyle's friend. And say he had the.
Yeah.
But Grosskreutz was the one who came at him with a gun.
Yeah.
And Grosskreutz had felony charges in the past.
Yeah.
So we will likely see. I mean, there's now video evidence of this guy. A proper prosecutor will now file charges against Grosskreutz for carrying a weapon as a felon.
Yeah, and the difference there is that'll be a federal charge because that's
right.
I mean, they could bring it in state court, but that's a federal 18 U.S.C. 922. It's a federal prohibition. The prohibition's much too broad, but there is certainly founding era precedent for prohibiting known violent people from possessing arms. So the Whiskey Rebellion, which everybody loves to talk about, what a lot of people don't know is coming out of that, the people that participated in the Whiskey Rebellion were prevented from possessing arms for 3 years. Okay. Right, and so that was right after our founding era, so it's likely that they understood that to be a constitutionally sound restriction. And so Gage had a violent felony conviction.
Right.
And so under the law and under founding era precedent, I mean, he could rightly be prohibited from possessing an arm.
So Coffey's still going to go to jail for that.
Yeah.
But there was no evidence in that trial that there's a cop and I get to shoot him, right? He had been in a situation where he no longer felt like people were there actually caring about his life, that they said, you have a right to your life and I'm not going to take it. And clearly somebody came to his window with a gun and his first reaction was to defend himself.
As a reasonable person's would be.
Right.
I mean, I would imagine that anybody that, regularly trains, shoots, has a firearm on their bedside table, if you saw a rifle pointed at you at, I don't remember the time, let's call it 3 a.m., middle of the night, no, not great. If you saw that happen at 3 a.m., I mean, your first reaction is, somebody is going to kill me.
Right.
I need to defend my life. And you have that right. And it is interesting that you're seeing people saying, no, you don't have this right to life, because it's this kind of communal perspective of rights. It's not this individual. You're also seeing people, and this was the important one that I think is going to be a huge talking point, is people said you don't have the right to defend property. And so a lot of people said, it doesn't matter if Kyle was defending the, car audio place.
Right.
It doesn't matter. You don't have a right to defend property, because property doesn't have the same value as human life.
Right.
And on the surface, right, that sounds right. Like, your house doesn't have the same value as, your life or another person's life, right? Like, that sounds like something that we could probably agree behind. But what people forget is property ownership is the basic tenet of how we exist in society and how we can live our lives and enforce our life, right? Without property, it all goes away.
It poses an interesting question that I would like to ask the people who say, and the prosecutor in the case, he said, you don't have the right to use deadly force to protect property. Mm-hmm. So he didn't say you don't have a right to protect property. You just don't have a right to use deadly force. Now, let's turn this on its head a little bit. I'm going to start with a sort of a more less likely scenario, but then I'm going to bring it back to something real. What if we became that communist country that many on the left are advocating for today? What if we were living under pure communism, and that car stereo store was owned by the government? Mm-hmm. And what if the government then called in Kyle and said, we want you to stand in front of this store of your, I don't remember if it was his grandfather's friend or his dad's friend or something. We want you to stand in front of that store and defend that store no matter what. Nobody is allowed to loot that store because that's a government-owned store. Would he be allowed to use lethal force then, and who would prevent him from doing it? And would anybody care? Would all these people on the left who say, no, you can't do that? Well, now he's doing it with government. Would they say, well, you can't kill somebody to defend that property?
I mean, in a pure communist society, I think that they would take issue with this idea that the store has to be defended from the people, because while the government owns it, right, it's the people, it's the commons. And so those people, if they truly need something from that car audio store, then they have the right to it, right? And under this conception. So I think they would disagree with the idea. I mean, these people that are focusing on this kind of progressive agenda on communism and on socialism don't understand that it's just a different, like, it's this offensive use of force. In their view, well, there wouldn't need to be a use of force.
Right.
There wouldn't even need to be a protest in the first place, Dave. It would be perfect. We would be totally fine.
Well, that's fair. There is this argument, though, of want versus need, right? I'm not talking about they're stealing a loaf of bread because they're hungry.
Yeah.
Nobody really needs a better sound system for their car. They might want it.
Oh, no, sir. If they take it, it just means that they needed it more than you needed it, or more than you needed the exchange for it. You can't tell them that
But it's not me. It's the government. The government now owns that. So do they need it more than the government does?
Well, the government will happily provide everything.
Oh,
right.
Okay.
I mean, that's the conception, is this side of it.
So the reality is the car audio store wouldn't even exist.
Yeah, because
so my analogy goes away. Now I'm gonna prove that my analogy actually happened. How many people on the left would say on January 6th the police should have used lethal force to kill the people trying to go into the Capitol building?
Yeah, a lot. Yeah, trying to seize the seat of government, right? A lot of people said that was a justified use of force.
So all of the people who are sitting there saying you can't use deadly force to protect property, to protect physical property. Mm-hmm. I mean, remember, your life is your property, your ideas are your property.
Yeah.
I'm talking about physical property owned by the government.
I think their argument would probably be more focused on that there were like politicians and representatives in the building more so than just the Capitol building. I also think that that's part of like giving them the most kind of credit. It's the symbolic seat. Because what you did see, right, is during a lot of protests, you saw, courthouses, public buildings during riots and whatnot being burned down and attacked, and people, being upset that federal law enforcement, that National Guard, and those things were all called in, and they had no problem complaining about that use of force. So I think they might draw a distinction, but it's all because it's not founded in any actual principle.
Right.
Right. It's all founded in this conception of, there is no objective truth. And, even if there is, we have the societal right to these things and we know what's best.
Right.
And so, I don't even think you get into those situations, kind of. But that's what is so important about, the Rittenhouse case and the coffee case. And we'll see what happens in the Arbery case is this reaffirmation of you have a right to defend yourself. And what was clear in this situation is Rosenbaum, the first person that was killed, was an aggressor. And, there's a lot that's coming out now of, he was just discharged from the hospital after a suicide attempt. He had tried to go and fill his medication because he had bipolar disorder, but he couldn't fill his medication because the store was boarded up because of the riots. And so he might have had real issues, but he was very clearly the aggressor.
Yeah.
I mean, that was really obvious from the video, from everything. And we got to a point where, a jury and the public is now talking about your right to protect your own life, to preserve your life. And that is so fundamental, and that is so important to our system of government. If you don't have the right to your own life, if you don't have the right to defend your own life, it all goes away. I mean, as soon as we give up the right to our own lives, I mean, that's slavery. I mean, that is the complete degradation of our system.
Absolutely.
And so I don't care if Kyle did it with an AR-15. I don't care if he, that time had managed to use his hands. I don't care what it is, right? The right to defend your life from an aggressor is just so fundamental.
And I think that's the point I was trying to get to is the progressive left has become so hypocritical in the way that they look at these things. And as members of the Vino Veritas Society, I think one of the most important things we can do is to understand the principles, understand our precepts and virtues, and stick to them, no matter what the situation is, and understand an individual's right to their own private property, and their right to defend it and to protect themselves and protect their property. And so I say that if people do decide to watch the Arbery case and they do follow that, this was a situation where there's a lot of questions, and you could make a very strong argument that he was using self-defense. The guys who came after him first did not necessarily follow the law as we understand it today. We might see more coming out of this trial, but part of their burden of proof in this is going to be proving that they actually witnessed him committing the crime in order to execute a citizen's arrest. But he was afraid for his life, and he was doing what he could to try to save his life. And I think in that case, we have to make sure we don't make the same mistakes the progressive left makes and say, well, emotionally, I feel like this is how it should have ended, and therefore that's the rule.
Yeah, and that by the time this comes out, that decision might have been rendered. I mean, it's happening as we speak. The jury is deliberating,
right? And
allegedly, they're coming out with a decision today as we record, so it might be out. But three things can be true if you look at principle, right? You can say Kyle Rittenhouse legally defended his own life and was justified in his use of force. Andrew Coffey legally defended himself and was justified in his use of force. And the people that followed Arbery in their vehicles and potentially had attacked him were not justified in their use of force.
Right.
And that just because he reached for their rifle, or the shotgun, if they were already the aggressor, Arbery was defending himself.
Right.
And would have been justified in his use of force if he was able to exercise that force. Those three things can all be true. And in our system, when you look at principle, right, people are going to reflexively look at Coffey and go, well, he killed cops. That's bad. But if you look at the actual facts, you have to ground it in principle. And if you look at the actual facts of Kyle, you have to ground it in principle. And in the Arbery case, it's the same thing. It's a lot harder because it's like this shaky cell phone video that the third guy shot from his truck. But it looked like the people in the truck were the aggressors.
Right.
And so when you stick to that principle of you can't go out looking, you can't be the aggressor, you can't go out and try and fight people and then claim self-defense.
Right.
But if somebody threatens your life, no matter who you are, and no matter who that person is, even if it's, you know, a law enforcement officer and you're not aware, you don't know what's going on. If you justifiably think that your life was threatened, you have the right to defend it. And that is just fundamental for us.
And it doesn't matter what your past is.
Exactly.
It
That's
doesn't
a really
matter.
good point.
And if you were a bad person in the past, if you're Coffee and you had a felony and you're committing another crime, you're still going to jail. Like that,
That's a really good point.
You can have both of those things at the same time. Even if you're a bad person who maybe deserves to go to prison for certain things, or deserved a longer prison sentence than you had, doesn't mean you lose your right to defend yourself and your property.
Right? You still have, just because you were convicted of assault 10 years ago, doesn't mean you don't have a right to your life anymore.
Right.
And if you have a right to your life, you have a right to defend your life.
Right.
And that's a really important point. That's a great point.
And that's what we always try to get across to our members. You know, that's why we are the guardians of the American idea.
And I think that's the big thing that I want more people to think about when they're thinking about not just self-defense, but anything, right? Principle doesn't always bring you to the place you want it to, right? Following our constitutional principles doesn't always mean that the thing that you think is right is right. You know, we're talking about taxation, right? This ability. A lot of people are against just general taxes. I mean, income tax, again, different. That's an amendment, but a lot of people are against it. Well, it's there. And so if you want to enforce a constitutional form of government, that means Congress has the power to lay taxes.
Yeah.
And so principle doesn't always bring you to where you think it should or where you want it to. But if you sit and you think and you critically apply it, you are, critical of yourself, you're careful to think about, whether you are a, back the blue bias or whether you're a pro BLM bias in the, Kyle Coffee cases, or, if you are cognizant of that and if you follow your principle through, it's going to bring you to the right place. It's just not always be the place that you want it to be.
Right. And I, at the same time, think that generally the people who are doing bad things in this world, eventually it's going to catch up with them. And don't go after someone just because you think they're a bad person and you think we need to get them out of society. A little patience goes a long way. Eventually it's going to catch up with them and they're going to do something that they should be principally put away for or removed. Well, thank you again for sitting in.
Are we? I can't tell because Tom's has this aversion to any sort of digital timekeeping.
It's that academic. It's that life in a classroom where they always had those analog clocks, right? So he just got so used to looking at that. So we do put a clock up on the wall.
I have to look at an analog clock that is also not adjusted for daylight savings time.
This is true. It tells you something. That's how long it's been since we've been in the studio.
Oh, that makes sense.
It's pretty wild. We started and realized we hadn't updated that yet. But
I have to poke fun. Sorry, it's absolutely. I wear an analog watch, but if I'm not making fun of Tom, then I've missed my opportunity of being on the podcast.
That is fair. Well, despite the jokes, we do hope he gets better quickly. This is it hit him fairly recently. It's only been about 24 hours, so not really sure where this thing is going to go for him. I don't know if it's going to be a quick recovery. I don't know if it's going to be sort of what I had. I went through this period where the first couple of days were rough, and then I started to feel a lot better. I mean, I did a podcast remote, but I did a podcast while I was sick, and then all of a sudden, about a week in, everything went south.
Yeah.
It was like I went through an eye of a storm, and then all of a sudden that second side hit me. So let's just hope Tom is back in the next week or two. And
Tom, I hope you get better and soon. And when you do, there's a bottle of Ardbeg, a cigar, and a conversation about Crisis of the House Divided waiting for you.
There we go. Thank you again, and to our members, Nos Sumas Custodes.
Nos Sumas Custodes.